Good afternoon. I am Damel Swebi, and I will be presenting on the role of the Dutch in the conquest and settlement of the Caribbean. In the 16th century, the Dutch rebelled for their freedom from the Spanish, forming the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Now, in 1568, seven northern Netherlands provinces gained their independence and formed the United Provinces of the Netherlands. This started a long struggle now known as the 80 Years' War. The Dutch then built themselves one of the most powerful naval forces at that time, as they could have managed themselves against other European fleets. This led to them building maybe the largest merchant marine of that time in the world, and this propelled them to become a European powerhouse. Their tradesmen did so well around the world that they were able to grant loans and give capital to financial institutions. They became a European powerhouse through trade and mercantilism. Amsterdam became the world's center of finance and insurance. All this made the Dutch quite powerful, and historians claim that once the Dutch entered a situation in those days, the scales were tipped. And this can be said to be true even today, as in the NATO and UN, a lot of attention is paid to the vote that the Dutch gives or the things that they suggest. The Dutch were attracted to the Caribbean due to one, business opportunities, trade. So the Dutch were always trying to find new trading routes or trying to find new business partners, and so the Caribbean was quite attractive to them. Partnerships with other Europeans. The Dutch formed alliances with other European countries such as France and England, and at that time, the main goal of enemies of Spain was to attack them at their new prized possession, which was the Caribbean. The third point, revenge and animosity, might not be as significant for this topic. However, it's worth mentioning that there was a lot of hate between the Spanish and the Dutch, and so the drive for revenge could have been one of the reasons they were attracted to the Caribbean as well. Upon entering the New World sweepstakes, the Dutch played devil's advocate, providing many goods and services which were crucial to the French and English campaign to undermine Spain. We will understand this statement a little better as we move along. Roles of the Dutch in the conquest and settlement of the Caribbean. Allied attacks on the Spanish monopoly. Together with the French and English, the Dutch challenged Spanish dominance in the Caribbean, illicit then eventually legal trading. We have to remember that the Dutch were businessmen at heart, and so they were always trading and looking to start new trading partners and all that. Pioneering the sugar revolution. We know how important sugar is to the history of the Caribbean. After Spain was given the West, European countries rebelled out of fear and jealousy. Now, in that time, Spain was not one of the more highly revered or highly respected European countries, say like France or England. And so, can you imagine how those countries felt that Spain was just given all this wealth? So, they were quite jealous. And also, Spain and these countries were not exactly the best of friends. They were at war at different times, and so fear was also a factor in these other European countries fighting against Spain receiving the Caribbean. The opportunity of finding new trade routes in the Caribbean led them to join forces with the challengers. Now, the Dutch were always trying to find more profit. They were always driven by profit and what wealth they could gain for Netherlands. And so this allowed them to join up with England and France in fighting against Spain. One of the ways in which the Dutch and their allies attacked the Spanish monopoly was through piracy. Piracy was the illegal robbery of ships and sometimes included raiding ports and port towns. Now, the buccaneers were basically pirates and were active throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, and they constantly attacked Spanish merchant ships, and they were usually from French, and Dutch origins. Now, the Dutch were very useful as pirates and buccaneers because they were well experienced seamen. So the pirates and buccaneers they constantly challenged the Spanish security on their ships and ports. The Triple Alliance in 1596. Now France and the Netherlands approached each other and made the first efforts of forming an alliance. However, they thought that they needed a third party in order to be more formidable. So what better third candidate than England, who at that time had the common enemy of Spain? And so these three countries came together and formed the Triple Alliance in 1596, with probably the common goal at the time was to help each other to fend off or fight against Spain. Products of the Triple Alliance: an English fleet of 40 warships with 10,000 English soldiers and 5,000 Dutch soldiers struck the city of Cadiz in 1596. To understand the Dutch input a little more, we have to look back at the events leading up to this attack. The Spanish seized Calais in 1588 after defeating the English, and the Queen believed that this was a good position for the Spanish to invade England. So she looked to the alliance for help, and through the alliance, the Dutch fleet admiral Johan Duvenvoorde was sent to England to advise on the construction of the English fleet. Also, the Dutch helped England to patrol the English Channel and the North Sea. So we can conclude that the Dutch did a lot more than just sending 5,000 soldiers on the time of the attack. About 200 Spanish ships were demolished and Cadiz was seized for 2 weeks. So this was an insight to how chaotic and dangerous for the Spanish the alliance was. Results of the attacks on the Spanish monopoly. Spain's hand was forced. Constant defensive efforts depleted Spain's finances and resources. Now Spain had to reevaluate her position because having to constantly use large sums of profit and manpower just for security and defense was getting quite exhausting, and so bankruptcy was setting in. As a result, peace agreements had to be made. So in 1598, Spain and France signed a treaty. England in 1604. The reason I have 1609 in bracket is because I found a few articles saying 1609 and also another few saying 1604, so I'm not too sure about that. Now, the Dutch were a special case. It is said that the King of Spain at that time, Philip II, was not willing to make peace with rebels that did not allow the public practice of the Catholic faith. And so instead of signing peace treaties, they reached a ceasefire in 1607 and then a truce in 1609. Another result of the attack was that access to the Caribbean was now easier, so trading was allowed under the peace agreements. So no longer was piracy and constant fighting the only way to gain in the Caribbean for the other European countries. More access allowed more boundaries to be crossed by the Europeans. Now that the English, the French, and the Dutch were able to trade, they now had access to the territories, and this opened the gates for encroachment to happen. And also, the Spanish could not effectively occupy the region, and so a lot of territories were left either unmonitored or not touched at all. And so the other Europeans were now able to take over these places. Take a look at these two maps. The map on the right is a very early representation of Spanish occupation of the Caribbean. The map on the left is a little later in the 17th century, and we can see the differences where now the Lesser Antilles are now occupied, and also these small islands, and the diversity is evident as well. We now have Spanish settlements, French settlements, English, and Dutch. So we see that the Dutch joining forces with France and England really had an impact on the settlement and conquest of the Caribbean. The next role of the Dutch in the conquest and settlement of the Caribbean is the illicit then eventually legal trading. The Dutch had established trade routes throughout the Caribbean long before peace arrangements allowed trade or allowed them back in Spanish ports. They were interested in from the Caribbean islands animal hides, ginger, Cania fistula. Cania fistula is a golden shower plant. I believe it's used for herbal medicine. However, it wasn't strange in that time for the Dutch to be trading and buying plants, as it was tulips that ended up crashing the Dutch stock market in the 1630s. They also were interested in sugar from the Caribbean islands. From Central America and parts of this of Southern America, they were interested in salt, indigo, tobacco, pearls, and gold. The Dutch mastered illicit trading and smuggling. Now, it's not a case where the French and English weren't doing smuggling and illicit trading. However, the Dutch were much more better at this than they were, and usually the better players have the most impact. The Dutch helped to provide lacking manufactured goods and materials from Europe. The Dutch were well experienced merchants, and so they knew how to work the market to provide what was in demand and what was needed. Also, merchandise from the smugglers were cheaper in comparison to those from the Spanish convoys, and so the colonials and other businessmen and so on, other people occupying the region at the time, were much more preferable to buying things from the smugglers, and the smugglers sometimes had the superior quality at times. Trade and smuggling was needed. The colonials often welcomed the smugglers out of absolute need, as they were isolated and poorly monitored. Now, Spain only sent an annual convoy to the Caribbean, and so this was just not enough. So the colonials really needed more supplies, more materials, more merchandise, and so the trading and smuggling was quite necessary for their upkeep. The Dutch West India Company. After the truce, trade was more structured. So, naturally, after being allowed back into Spanish ports and so on, the Dutch no longer had to be, sneaking around the corners to trade and smuggle goods. They were now more open with their trading and so on, which was good for them. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was formed. And so the Dutch West India Company was formed by the Dutch to oversee their business in the West Indies, their trade and commerce in the West Indies. The company also controlled the Dutch territories in the Caribbean at the time, such as Tobago, the ABC Islands, Berbice, and so on. Now let's look at some of the results. Colonials and other Europeans were helped. European goods and materials assisted in colonial and Caribbean life, helped in transforming ports into towns and cities. So the smuggling and trade helped to provide some of the physical materials and equipment needed to build up towns, and also it provided some of the things that people needed, such as fabric for clothing, familiar foodstuff, and even weaponry. The next point says European market for Caribbean goods was nurtured. Caribbean goods became available more and more in Europe. The Dutch moved between the Caribbean and Europe relatively frequently, and so they helped to maintain European need and interest in Caribbean goods. So the more the Europeans got goods from the Caribbean, the more they chose to invest and send more citizens to take part in the festivities of the Caribbean. And so, as the second point here says, interest in the Caribbean increased. The final role we look at is the pioneering of the sugar revolution. So, the Dutch West India Company seized Recife, Brazil in 1630. They controlled this area until 1654. Now, the area around Recife was the most successful sugar producing area in Brazil at the time, and the Dutch controlled this area until around 1654 when Brazil declined economically and the Dutch were expelled from the area. So now they had to shift their sugar manufacturing focus with all this knowledge and sense of cultivating sugar cane and making sugar that they had gained over this time. At that time, sugar was in demand in Europe, so tea culture and the pastry industry were gaining popularity, while honey became scarce. Honey was the original sweetener used in tea and pastry at that time. Now, the Dutch, being businessmen who were always looking for new partners, engaged the English with a plan for all this knowledge that they had gained while in Brazil. And so the Dutch taught the English how to cultivate sugar. Let's look into this a bit more. One of the key realizations was that the current workforce was not suitable for cultivating sugar. So, indentured Europeans and the infrequent supply of African slaves were not reliable enough. But the Dutch had it all figured out, and so the Dutch provided the workforce, and this was done with African slaves, as they believed that the Africans were best suited for the harsh working conditions. They provided the capital, so the Dutch, through their wealth and financial savvy, gave the English who needed it, because probably not all of them were unable to set up their own plantations. So the English who weren't so wealthy and could not afford to set up plantations on their own, the Dutch helped them with funds to do that. The Dutch also provided the technology. So the Dutch provided the sugar cane and the equipment needed for the processes. So, for example, the cane mill, which they knew how to set up and operate. And very importantly, the Dutch helped them to secure marketing deals. So they didn't just give them a product and left them to figure out the rest on their own. They actually helped them to secure partnerships and deals so that they would be able to sell their produce in the end. And now the results. The Dutch credit system helped colonials afford setting up plantations. So those who were financially unable to join the sugar train weren't left behind thanks to credit from the Dutch. European colonizers now had a profitable product that was ideal for the tropical West Indies and hence placed more interest, investment, and Europeans throughout the region. So the knowledge passed on to the English and sugar production didn't remain with the English. So eventually sugar production spread throughout the region, hence the sugar revolution. And this boosted the appeal of the African slave trade. So some European countries were unsure of the ethical sanctions of the African slave trade, and some of them were even unsure of the religious views on it, while others were in total opposition to the act. And after seeing the success of the sugar production in the Caribbean using the slaves from the slave trade, more Europeans were now willing to accept the ethical and religious backlash. Also, others just didn't bother to care about it anymore. Now, a quick summary of the three roles. The Dutch joined forces with the challengers and constantly threatened the Spanish control, forcing Spain to sign peace agreements in addition to relaxing restrictions. Secondly, the Dutch conducted illegal trade throughout the Spanish Caribbean, moving goods between the region and Europe up until the time of receiving permission from Spain to trade, supporting colonials and preserving a European market for Caribbean goods. And the final role, Dutch knowledge and expertise on sugar production led to them setting off the sugar revolution in the Caribbean. Thanks for listening. I hope it was informative.